Hi everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds, a kidlit loving edition, even a nonfiction picture book loving edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. And glad on this episode to be talking with author Lindsay Metcalf. Lindsay, thank you for jumping in, joining, and bringing lots of children's books with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure, absolutely. I am going to ask first about the medal that is curiously hanging over your shoulder. It is just kind of dangling there. Um, Curious
Uh,
about that.
so I live in Kansas, and one of my books, called Farmers Unite,
Uh-huh.
was named a Kansas Notable Book in 2021. And they send you to the state capitol. And at that time, I think it was the first gentleman of Kansas.
Hmm.
Um, giving out the medals at this ceremony. So that was really the first time as an author that I felt like I had really arrived. And
Love
so
it,
I
love
just
it.
leave it hanging up here to remind me on my bad days that it's going to be okay.
Absolutely. I love the mementos, love the celebrations of victory, love it. And I was going to mention three titles, and I said this before we hit record, but I think all three are right there over your shoulder. So if you want to mention others, please do. But No World Too Big, No Voice Too Small, and Beatrix Potter, Scientist, which has kind of there's a rhyme scheme kind of there that works. I like that title. That's good.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other titles that you'd like to mention before we dive in and talk a little bit about the origins?
I've got a few on the way, but those are the only ones that are published. The next one coming out is called Outdoor Farm, Indoor Farm, and that
Hmm.
one's informational fiction. So that'll be my first technically fiction title, but yeah, you've covered it well.
Fantastic, fantastic. There's a lot that goes into writing for young people and writing picture books in particular, lots of choices. So appreciating that work. What was it about the written word that connected you and inspired you to become an author?
I think books were my first friends,
Yeah.
probably.
Hmm.
I grew up on a farm, and I remember my parents being really busy when I was young. I don't know if they were more busy than average parents, but it seemed like they were busy. But
Hmm.
what they did provide me with was a stack of books on tape. So they would, I don't know where they got them because we lived in a rural community with no bookstore, but they would be these paperback books. Some were Disney, some were Berenstain Bears, maybe, or
Hmm. Hmm.
there were some like Roger Hargraves books in there. But the paperback book would be what I would look at. And I had these giant headphones and then these cassette tapes, and it would read it to me.
Uh-huh.
And I learned to follow along by listening for the page turns. And there was always exciting music. And I love them so much. So I carried that with me, and I started writing my own books probably in first grade as soon as I could write anything at all.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And they were they were kid books, kid written books. So they were like lots of misspellings and not very sophisticated at all. But I felt like I was an author at that time. I knew I liked to write, but as I grew older, I didn't see anyone writing books in my community. So I didn't know that that was something that you could do. But what I
Uh-huh.
did see was my parents reading the newspaper every day. And so I started getting interested in current events and journalism. And I ended up deciding to go to school for journalism. I went to the University of Kansas and worked in newspapers as a reporter and an editor for quite a few years. And so that was my way in to the profession of writing.
Uh-huh.
And I wanted to do that because I wanted to share stories with people that they may not have known, things that would impact their lives, things that would help them in their daily lives. And so I was enjoying journalism, but then I had two babies within 17 months of each other. And I
Uh-huh.
decided I just wanted to stay home and take a break for a while. And while they were growing, we read a lot of picture books. And those new picture books, I hadn't touched children's books since I was that little kid reading the books on tape, right?
Uh-huh.
But I loved what I was seeing. They were completely different from the ones I had grown up reading, and I wanted to see if I could write it myself. And with this huge conceit of me actually being a public or a professional writer, I thought, well, I should be able to handle this. This should not
Uh,
be a problem. And it was much harder than I thought it would be to write a children's book. And for some reason, I didn't realize that I could write nonfiction children's books. That just did not occur to me, even though I was writing true stories for adults.
mhm.
So it took me longer than I would like to admit to come into my groove. But once I did, I realized that true stories, there are so many true stories that have not been written for children, that will help them grow and become, contributing adults and informed voters. And there are just so many things that I'd like to share with kids. So that's the long and short of it, I guess.
Love that. I love that. And I love the journey. I love kind of finding your voice. And there's this great literary tradition of authors that trained as journalists and just figuring out the economy of words and working in that kind of way. So I love that as well.
Oh, for
Um,
sure. And you learn how to be edited
yes.
because, especially at a newspaper, there's no mercy.
Yeah.
And you have to be okay with not being precious with your words.
Yeah. Yeah. So your books tend to tackle subjects that are really empowering, really interesting in that way. You mentioned sort of being an informed voter and then thinking about writing about the life of Beatrix Potter from this different perspective that's outside the norm of what we usually get, sort of this empowering perspective on a very well-known author. So I'm curious about what you hope readers take away from your work.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And especially with Beatrix Potter, I had read Peter Rabbit as a kid,
Hmm.
and I didn't know anything about the author. I just knew that her name was this all caps name on the front of the book. And I can picture the font even.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
knew nothing about her. And then when I learned that she had this whole other life, she was studying fungi and mycology, and she wrote a paper for the Linnean Society of London, and she did this for 10 years before she ever wrote a children's book. Then I thought, if I were a kid and I had known that, I think I would have so much appreciated that. Not only her love for science and for the not so pretty side of science, like she had mouse skeletons in her closet, and
Yeah.
um, just she wasn't afraid to get dirty. And I think I would have loved knowing that as a little girl. And I would have loved knowing that she wasn't just one thing.
Mhm.
She grew up to be this author that was famous, and that was an amazing career, but she also had other eras of her life. And the scientist part was only one of them. I mean, she ended up being a farmer. She was a conservationist who protected thousands of acres of the English countryside in her later years. So I think that is one thing. I want readers to know that their stories matter and that their voices matter and their perspective matters,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
sometimes where you come from makes it hard to believe that about yourself. But it's always true.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely, and that's such a keen eye for that author to have to pick up on so much in science and the natural world, and then to create something fantastical out of it as well.
Yeah, I was completely enthralled by that marriage of science and art that
Hmm.
she just naturally came to. I mean, we talk about the acronym STEAM, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Science, tech, engineering, and math. But how does that look in practice? Sometimes it's hard to visualize that. It's more abstract. So for her, it was just a way of life. She was out in nature as much as possible. She was always drawing. She was always recording what she was seeing and then
Hmm.
learning more about each species and identifying different plants. And this was all from a young age. And so she used this precise knowledge of all of the things that she was drawing, and then she used it and twisted it later on into these lovely drawings that were anatomically correct,
Hmm.
but just had such a fun voice and view of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the writing craft of parallel structure, to parallel that, what is your research process like as an author?
That's a good question. I think my tendency is to research more than necessary usually.
Hmm.
It's my favorite part. I think I come up with story ideas. I keep a list of story ideas running all the time, as any writer will do. And it's the ones that keep speaking to me, the ones that I think about late at night sometimes, or while I'm out on a walk. Usually it takes me a while to really dive into it, but I realize that the ones that won't let me go are the ones that I need to work on and create as a book. So at that point, I will just look into everything I can, every angle that I can, using my journalism background to learn more. So for like the No Voice Too Small, No World Too Big books, that is a collaboration between me and two other authors, Jeanette Bradley and Keela Dawson. And
Hmm.
so for that, it looks different than like my historical books like Beatrix Potter, Scientist, and this novel in verse that I'm currently working on about an 1800s um, female scientist. But I think the common thread is that you just look for as much information as possible. So for contemporary subjects, as the ones in No Voice Too Small and No World Too Big are, we start with a Google search, as everyone would do, and look deeper and deeper for as much information as possible. And then for those, we write about a lot of juveniles. So we want to make sure we have permission to include them in the books.
Hmm.
And so the next step is reaching out to them, possibly asking for interviews or asking if they have anything else they want to share about themselves, and just not being afraid to broach the subject in a more personal way.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I guess once we've got that information gathered, just trying to make a outline sketch before starting writing.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool.
The historical books, I have subscriptions to like newspapers.com and Newspaper Archive, and Ancestry has been a huge one for me in the
Mm.
last project that I've been working on. And I just love digging into old documents and trying to piece together a narrative from bits that you get here and there. Like you may have a passport application that says what color their eyes were, or you may have a letter that they wrote that you found in an archive somewhere. You may know what their state census looked like and where they lived and how many horses they owned, or if they owned a carriage or a piano forte, as they called them back in the 1800s.
Hmm.
So putting together, collecting all those bits and then creating a story out of it is really fun for me.
Yeah, yeah, kind of like a puzzle in a way, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, so you mentioned a novel in verse as well as a book that's on the way. So I always like to give space for talk about those things that are coming, those things that are next, as well as places where people can go to connect with you and reach out, follow your work, have you on for school visits and things like that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I probably shouldn't share much more about the novel in verse yet because we haven't announced it, but I can talk about the picture book that's coming out. It is a sparse text rhyming book,
Hmm.
comparing traditional outdoor farms to indoor vertical factory farms. And I wrote it because I grew up on this farm and I learned that indoor factory farms existed and I wanted to learn more. So I started challenging myself also to write it in as few words as possible. Actually, there was a contest called 50 Precious Words run by a writer named Vivian Kirkfield. And
Hmm.
so I thought, I'll just try to write this in 50 words. And I did, and it wasn't the greatest first draft I've ever written, but I could see that there was more there than just a one-off.
Hmm.
So I continued working on it, and now the story is 116 words and it rhymes. But the reason it's informational fiction is because the illustrator, when she came on board, she took this factual story that I had written, more, it's rhyming, but it's also more expository. And she had to create a narrative through line in the illustrations. And what she
Mm,
did was she created two characters um, who became pen pals, and they were sharing information about each of their respective farms. And now I can't imagine the book any other way.
yeah.
It's really, really cool how it turned out. Um, I think the next project after that is fall 2025, and it's another narrative nonfiction historical story picture book. It's called Tomatoes on Trial,
Oh,
the
nice,
Fruit
nice.
versus Vegetable Showdown. And it's about the real 1893 Supreme Court case in which tomatoes were declared a vegetable. So I
Oh.
had a ton of fun writing that. Very hard-hitting case, obviously.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Lots of puns in that. And I think tons of opportunity for kids to argue about what they think tomatoes really should be or really are. Um, so yeah, and then we have a third anthology. These No Voice Too Small and No World Too Big are poetry anthologies, and we have a third one in the works for 2026 called No Brain the Same, and it's about young neurodivergent activists,
Love it, love it.
which we're really excited about.
Yeah, yeah.
Then as
What?
far as how to reach me, I have a website, lindsayhmetcalf.com, and you can find out about all of the books and information about school visits. I love meeting readers. And I'm also on Instagram and Twitter and several of the news sites like Blue Sky and Threads.
Mhm.
And it's just at Lindsay H. Metcalf on all of them.
All right, wonderful. Well, you have a creative trajectory ahead, which I love, and looking forward to the work that's on the way. And I appreciate the time. Did we miss anything that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
No, I don't think so. I just really appreciate you having me on. It's been fun chatting with you.
Yeah, great to chat with you as well, and glad to have you back anytime. Thanks so much.
Thank you.